know what's so wrong. All I wanted to do was do good makeup and review books, and it just didn't go according to plan. I don't know what happened. I don't know. And then I tried to fix it by adding more highlighter, more bronzer, and then it just got worse and worse, and then my eyes are burning, and holy crap. Again. Yeah, that sounds preferable. Oh. Well, what do I do with this? Okay. Huh. That's weird. Where did this come from? Alright. Well, I guess I'll put it on. Not obvious at all. Hello my precious little dragons, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're having a beautiful, amazing, wonderful day today. I feel like I have a little bit of deja vu about something, but I'm not sure what. Like, I just feel like I've already done this makeup look before. Huh. Hi. Today I am going to be doing a book look on Again But Better by Christine Riccio. Riccio, probably. She is better known probably to the booktube community as, what is it, Poland Bears and, oh, Poland Bananas Books, because it's in all caps, so you obviously have to yell it. I did not know she was a YouTuber before I read the book, and I will get into part of that as we go on. But yes, so let us do a brief synopsis really quick while I prime my skin. Christine describes this book as basically a coming of age for 20-something, and the coming of age that she wanted to have when she was that age. So basically our main character, Shane, is a 20-year-old pre-med student who has been pushed by her parents to be a doctor when she secretly wants to be a writer. She signs herself up for a study abroad creative writing program in London and tells her parents it is a pre-med program. So obviously this is going to end well. Yeah. So she views the study abroad as her chance to do college better, to actually make lifelong friends, to have her first kiss, and to have a chance to actually pursue her dreams. Also, it's the 4th of July. Please don't mind the fireworks that are inevitably going to go off. First, everything seems to be going according to plan, and there is a potential relationship with a boy who is also in the study program named Pilot. But when everything falls apart for Shane's plans, the book picks up again 6 years later from 2011 to now 2017 and follows whether Shane's coming of age will ever get a second chance. That's the brief synopsis here. That's what we got. As per usual, I am going to be doing some notes at the beginning, which will kind of go over my general thoughts on the book. Then I'm going to be doing some character notes. I don't think any of my character notes for this one are really spoilery. And then we will get into the plot, which is the spoiler section. So as per usual, once we get to the spoiler section, you guys can feel free to skip ahead to the final look and thoughts. I will of course have a timestamp down below, but let's go ahead and get started with our general thoughts. So as I mentioned, part 1 of this book takes place in 2011 during the initial study abroad program, and part 2 takes place 6 years later in 2017. So this is after kind of our turning point of the book where things kind of fall apart for Shane. And we just skip ahead to kind of catch up with her and see if she can actually get this second chance that she so desperately wants. So I did like the author's note about how she wanted this to be a coming of age book for 20-something, so something that she had never seen in YA. I appreciate people wanting to do some things different, and being also a 20-something who kind of fits into her category, because she categorizes this coming of age as, like, you know, all the first kisses and the romance and the relationships. Like, she kind of is categorizing it from that perspective. So given that description, I fall pretty heavily into that category as a 20-something who's never been in a relationship or done any of that sort of stuff. So as someone who's theoretically in a lot of the same places as Shane, I feel like I am decently qualified to give an informed opinion on this book, and I realize that it is meant to be a YA coming of age, so it's meant to be a little more on the fluffy side rather than the heavily realistic side. However, because I fit into the target audience, I feel like my opinion matters on this one, just a little bit. Okay, overall, I understand the need for part 1 that focuses on the initial study abroad trip. However, I hate foundations without a pump. Why do you exist? Okay, sorry. I understand the need for part 1, but it felt like it dragged on and its details and didn't quite hit the mark to me. I liked part 2 much better, which that will kind of be a recurring theme a little bit as we get into the stuff. And obviously once we get into the spoiler stuff, I can get into a bit more of why I specifically liked part 2 more than part 1, but there's some things that I can expound upon here. One of my major hang-ups with this book was the writing style. So and this is going to sound very, I'm not sure how this is going to sound. It sort of reads to me like a Wattpad fanfiction. It's not a fanfiction, but that's how it reads. So it has just the way it describes things, how it's just very heavy-handed in its pop culture references, and it has a quirky main protagonist. Like, I wasn't sure at the beginning if it was a good or bad thing, but like as it went on, I was more iffy on it. It's also in a stream of consciousness writing style, so that means it is first person point of view, which is obviously from Shane's point of view. So it has this stream of consciousness writing style, which basically means that whatever is in Shane's brain is on the page, which, even if that's a fairly accurate depiction to how I or even most people think a lot of the time, it's still kind of jarring to read. Especially it seems accurate to how I thought was much more youthful and fandom-y, like back when I was 15 or so. 15 is gonna come up a lot in this. It does have a lot of fandom-y stuff, and it's like Wattpad deja vu, a lot of fandom-y stuff, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, just in like a published book versus like going to Wattpad specifically to read fanfiction is just a little weird, and I haven't really been involved in that in a few years, so again, just a little jarring. The description of the clothes and the hair and the skin tones and everything, what I thought maybe that was part of what was coming across as fanfiction-y to me. I'm still not totally sure on that. It was like everything. Everything came across as fanfiction-y to me. Like everything. Even though, again, it's not actually a fanfiction, it's just how it was reading. And once I found out she was a YouTuber, because again, I did not know she was a YouTuber until I read the author's note section at the end of the book. It felt like it explained a lot, and I watched a couple of her videos, and her personality does seem very much like she's very bubbly. And so I thought, you know, that could probably explain a lot of it. Like maybe her 20-something wanting a coming-of-age book looks very different than my 20-something wanting a coming-of-age book, because it just felt like it read a lot younger than it was. Like, I as a 20-year-old who theoretically would be in a lot of the same headspace, I guess, as Shane, I would approach things very differently than Shane, which, I mean, obviously there's character personality differences or whatever, but it just, I don't know, it was just a lot of weirdness to me, I guess, which is a bad way of explaining it. And again, with the writing style, because it reminded me so much of Wattpad, and I used to write fan fiction a lot, like when I was, you know, like, I'd say probably like 12 to 16 was like my peak fan fiction writing phase, and I wrote a lot in that first person POV stream of consciousness style. So throughout the entire book, I just felt very, very weird because I felt like I was reading my writing style. Like what would that be? How long ago was 15? Like a lifetime? But it felt like I was reading my 15-year-old writing style, but now like as a 22-year-old. So it was a little jarring from that perspective. So maybe for other people who have never really been involved in the fanfiction realm and never written like that, it wouldn't be quite as jarring. But for me personally, it was just really weird throughout a lot of the book to suddenly be going like, I used to write like that, and then knowing that it's being written by another person who is like older than me but writing the style like they're me at 15. Like, I don't know, it was just weird, and I couldn't decide how I felt about it, because sometimes I was like, well, it's just their writing style, and other times I'm like, but this was my writing style when I was 15. I don't know. And like, maybe that's like a really weird criticism to have, but it was just, again, kind of jarring. It kept taking me out of the story. And I think stream of consciousness is a very, very, very difficult type of writing style to do well. And it just, there was a lot of places where I felt it just kind of missed the mark a little bit. And I think particularly with it having so many pop culture references, that isn't the type of book that necessarily ages well, because it's just like inundated with pop culture references. Like, not just a few, like all over the place. Which, and I think again that was part of what made it seem a little bit more fanfiction-y to me rather than, you know, a straight up YA book. One thing that was difficult for me, and again, I really wasn't the biggest fan of part 1. Again, I understand why it had to be there, because it kind of established everything that happened in part 2, but it felt like it just went on for a really long time. And I know that not really getting to know people deeper in part 1, other than the initial quirky top layer that was a little shallow, was very intentional on the author's part, because that's part of how we get to see Shane's character has matured and developed by part 2. But it still makes me wish that part 1 was a lot more streamlined, because there was times where it just did drag a lot before I got to the part where it made sense. So early on in the book I was like, do I really want to keep reading this? I'm not sure if I like this. The writing style is kind of grating. The characters aren't really connecting. They seem just your general quirky, shallow YA characters. And though it did improve in part 2, I feel like it tried hard to make them more than one-dimensional and didn't completely succeed. Kind of, but only on a couple of the characters. I don't know. It was just, for me, that part was just kind of eh. This isn't a total spoiler. There is a bit of a magic system. There is a bit of magic in this book that comes into play. It is a very, very soft magic system. And I was actually okay with the fact that it wasn't really explained, therefore it being a soft magic system, because it is a fluffy kind of rom-com style book, so you don't really need the detailed explanations. It just kind of is, and it is. Miscommunication and intentional deception play a rather big role in this book. As mentioned, Shane goes to London without telling her parents the true nature of the study abroad program, even though they're also paying for her schooling. And so this, of course, is going to end so well, so well. And there's also some miscommunication between Shane and Pilot, and while they do kind of work through it, though, just those two plot devices are not my favorite. I don't really like, especially miscommunication. It's rarely done in a way that is not infuriating. Like, just talk to each other. So because there are consequences and the consequences are kind of worked through, I don't mind it as much. Still not my favorite. There's a couple little things I want to like touch on, I guess, before we get into like the really big stuff. So one thing that, again, I feel kind of qualified to talk on is the study abroad. So I did a study abroad in Japan when I was 15, and so I kind of relate to that study abroad experience. I did really like how much research she put into the foreign aspects of it, like the specific places they went, the culture, little things that made it obvious to me that she's either done the study abroad in that specific location, or that she at the very least has been there or done like a crazy extensive amount of research. One such instance was there's a part in the book where Shane is like wondering where on earth all the street signs are in London, and having gone to London last year and wondered the same thing, I was like, okay, yeah, that's relatable, because it's such an accurate sentiment for like an American who's going over to London. There was one moment which was just kind of mildly infuriating to me, which I'm not sure if it was intended to be that way or if it was just a mistake. However, there's a part in the book where Pilot and Shane go to a Tesco, and I think it's either their first night in London or it's somewhere around there. It's really close to the beginning. And so they go look for pasta to make, and so they're talking about, oh, there's not enough variety of spaghetti sauce or whatever. Anyway, somehow in there, because Shane is typical quirky in that she's clumsy. Yeah, she knocks over a jar of pasta sauce and it shatters. So they just leave it there. And I'm like, excuse you, what? You just left it there? That's so rude. Like, what? You didn't even... They just kind of ran out and they didn't like alert anyone. They're not like, hey, I'm so sorry, can we like help clean this up? Alert anyone? Like, they just left this shattered pasta sauce all over the floor of the Tesco, and I was like, who does that? Like, is this a thing? Are people just that rude? Like, why would you just leave that there? Oh my goodness, don't. Why? So they just leave it there, and it just, why? It's so easy to just tell someone and apologize and ask to clean it up, and they, why? Again, it's such a small thing. It's inconsequential to the plot, but definitely just mildly infuriated me. I did like that they had chapter titles in the books. That is one thing that I really miss in a lot of books in general, is just having chapter titles. Like, it's so boring just to have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Like, name your chapters. It's so much fun. It gives you a little hint of what's to come. I did like that. I liked that they had that. Alright, moving on to the characters. The main characters' names in this book are so weird. And it's harped on that their names are weird. So we have Shane is our main character, obviously, and Shane is a girl, but she's named Shane, so okay, whatever. Then you have Pilot, and it's like, okay, he's the main love interest, also kind of a weird, quirky, unusual name. And then you have the three other friends that are the flatmates that are also in the study abroad program. So there's Atticus, who is Pilot's flatmate. I mean, Atticus, I guess, it's a little old-fashioned, but yeah, whatever. So that one doesn't bother me as much. Oh, wow, I had some bad fallout there. And then you have Babe, who ends up being, like, Shane's best friend. And then there's Sarah, spelled S-A-Y-R-U-A, and it's not pronounced like Sarah, it's Sarah, okay? But those are like the names of like all of your main characters, and it just felt really like it was trying too hard. Like, there's very few normal names in the cast of main characters, and so like, and maybe this is just personal preference, but I feel like when it comes to unique names, and this is again like speaking as someone who has a unique name, I feel like to make a name unique, that means it's different. So giving your entire cast of main characters really weird, unusual names like downplays the uniqueness and just makes it seem a little out of place. So I would give most people usual names, or at least ones that are semi-normal, and then sprinkle in your unusual names. Like, if Shane was the only unusual name, it wouldn't have bothered me. I'd be like, okay, there's a character named Shane. But Shane, in addition to Babe, Sarah, Atticus, and Pilot, just made me go, okay, I guess. So Shane as a character. I mean, she's kind of, especially in part 1, your typical quirky YA main character, and it tries to be a lot more in-depth than it ends up being. I will give her that her favorite Harry Potter book is Prisoner of Azkaban. Good choice. Sure. Again, I like her much better in part 2, where she's matured a bit and is not so like flighty and naive. Like, or she's sometimes relatable and sometimes just annoying, and I would say in part 1 especially, she trends a little bit more annoying for me. And because she's our main POV and you see everything through the lens of her consciousness, it's a little bit more eh. Her relationship with her parents is probably realistic. Again, as mentioned before, they have pushed her into the pre-med field, and that is definitely a relatable thing that a lot of kids have had to go through, with their parents forcing them into a field that they view as lucrative, that the kids aren't particularly passionate about, which is definitely a sad occurrence, and that is something that is kind of, I would say, the emotional heart of the book. While it should be focused on the coming of age and pilot and everything, it really seems to be more focused on her with her parents and how they relate. And I don't necessarily mean that, like, that's not a bad thing. However, I think the constant pressure would make her slightly less flighty and fandom obsessed, at least by age 20, which is where we meet her. Like, or at least that part of her would be repressed more to the standards it's at in part 2, where it takes far longer to come out than it does. So I could see her still having that part of her that's much more creative and naive and flighty and like a lot, but I feel like with how her relationship with her parents is described, it doesn't seem realistic for her to like kind of wear all of that on her sleeve, even though she's in this space that she views as safe, which is London, which is very far away from her parents. It's still like, I feel like that's something that gets kind of ingrained into you, that you really can't just, you can't turn it off and on. You have these walls built up that take some time to come down, but she's just like fandom, woo, like the whole time. Until part 2, where again she's had this major turning point and she is a lot more of that mature, repressed, she thinks through things, she's more cautious. It's a lot more realistic a portrayal in part 2, and again I think that is very intentional on the author's part, that she wanted to contrast the two, but part 1 just reads much too young to be a 20-year-old pre-med student whose parents have put all of these pressures on her to be perfect. To me anyway. Pilot, he is your typical, hold on, I keep forgetting to do my makeup. I'm sorry guys. Concealer. What concealer am I using? So Pilot is your kind of typical YA fanfic perfect boy. And he has just enough attitude and flaw in part 2 that it makes you kind of wonder how much was intentional and how much is just kind of how the author like unintentionally wrote him, and it's really hard to tell. I mean, I don't have a lot else to say beyond that. He's basically Shane, but in love interest mode, because they're both quirky, they're both like kind of repressed creatives. Yeah. Leo. So Leo is a kind of side character. He is Shane's cousin, and they used to be very close. Throughout part 1, he doesn't really play a major role. He and Shane have kind of drifted apart. Like, he's sort of viewed as being mean or insensitive by Shane in part 1. Other than noting those things that I just mentioned, he doesn't really do anything in part 1. However, in part 2, what happens with Leo feels like one of the most genuine parts of the book. And Shane discovers the why of why they became distanced and how she didn't really, like, she was too focused on herself to pay attention to what was happening with Leo, and why Leo's social and familial life was falling apart, and Shane subsequently tries to fix it. She tries to repair this relationship that fell apart. And I really, really liked that part of the book. That actually, to me, felt the most heartwarming, even though it was still a relatively small part of the book. And it kind of plays into that author's choice I mentioned toward the beginning, where it was the author intentionally making the relationships more superficial in the first part of the book, and then fleshing them out in the second part, because it's part of how Shane has matured. However, that also contributes to the fact that part 1 drags and feels much too long, and I almost stopped reading at part 1 because I just wasn't getting enough. Like, it went on for so long that I was like, okay, this isn't enough to qualify as the light, fluffy read, because it's going on for so long, but there's not enough depth to kind of keep me in. So I am glad that I stuck through to part 2 to kind of see at least those aspects come to fruition. But it's, again, it's just kind of a fair warning. Babe, Sarah, and Atticus exist. They don't really get fleshed out a lot. There's a character called Chad that is supposed to be Babe's love interest, like her friend that she has a crush on, and his name is Chad. And Shane's like, we'll see about this Chad. And I'm like, his name is Chad. And then, like, I was like, okay, well, they're probably gonna have him be this really nice guy, da-da-da-da-da. No, he's your stereotypical Chad. And so I'm like, this had to be an intentional choice given the other pop culture references. Like, the author really wanted this to be, like, something that the audience was clued into, like, this isn't going to end well, kind of things. And I'm like, yep, that's basically what it was. Yep, Chad is a Chad. I guess that probably could have counted as a spoiler, but whatever. Is this too dark for me? Probably. Whatever. Oh, we're bronzing up today because we're on study abroad and we're getting out in the sun and doing walking and stuff. So we are going to go into plot stuff. So from this point on, there will be spoilers. Fair warning. If you don't want to see spoilers, you can go ahead and click on the timestamp down below in the description and skip ahead to my final look and thoughts on the book. And then if you don't mind spoilers, well then you can just stick around, of course. So let's get into the plot. I'm going to kind of go in chronological order. So one thing that kind of stuck out, again, kind of as a more unrealistic sore thumb, was where like Shane talks a lot about the money stuff. So she's like, you know, her parents are paying for college, da 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 da. And one thing that stuck out is she's like, oh, I made all this money from summer jobs that I saved up for the study abroad trip, da 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 da. And she has enough money somehow to go to Rome for a weekend and Paris for a weekend. Like, these are just trips that the group goes on. And I was like, you have enough money for all of this, and it wasn't a planned trip, it was a last-second trip to Rome. They're like, hey, let's go to Rome this weekend. Hey, let's go to Paris next weekend. Like, you have enough money for this last-second trip to Rome and Paris? As a college student, like, and you're not described as particularly affluent. None of these, I mean, enough to go on the study abroad trip in the first place, but, I mean, I don't know, I was just like, really? Really? I can't relate. Like, do you know how much that costs? Okay. Oh wait, that's the topper. This one first. So that was one thing, I guess. I was just like, okay. So, and the Paris trip is like the turning point, or the first turning point of the book, I should say, which was, it was okay. It's supposed to be like this romantic sort of turning point, and then there's the actual turning point, which comes in a bit. At the beginning of the book, there is this Starbucks lady. So she's described as the plain / Starbucks lady, and she kind of encourages Shane to pursue her goals for, like, I want to have my first kiss, I want to make friends, I want to, like, all of this stuff that she has as her goals. And she pretty much encourages her to pursue this. And she keeps showing up. And at first, this really bothered me. I was like, okay, this is way too much beyond coincidence. Like, I can't. There is a reason for her showing up, because magic. Once we got to part 2 and it was actually explained, like, what was going on with this lady, I was like, okay, it doesn't bother me as much now, because it was explained. But before that, I was just like, okay, if there is not a solid reason for why on earth this lady keeps showing up, I'm going to have problems because it's just way too much coincidence. Like, too much. I couldn't take it. But again, that's this part 1, part 2 issue, and yeah, really want to keep rehashing this. So, relationship notes for part 1. She keeps almost kissing Pilot, and then she chickens out, and then she cries. And I couldn't tell if it was relatable or not, because even me, who is in the same position as her, where I've never been in a relationship, never kissed a person, and I am also a person very, like, I have anxiety. Even I am just like, oh my gosh, stop, just stupid, get it over with, just kiss him. Stop chickening out and crying. You both obviously like each other, whatever. Which then you get into the whole fact that he does have a girlfriend and they know all this, and it just, again, that's a weird thing, because Pilot describes it as kind of like, well, we're kind of together, kind of not, whatever. Anyway, but there's relationship troubles because of aforementioned girlfriend who shows up at the climax of part 1. Like, there's relationship drama there. And then her first kiss ends up being with this, like, random club guy, which was kind of unsatisfying. Very unsatisfying. Okay, her parents show up, which is the actual turning point of the part 1. And it just feels a bit contrived. Like, there may be some parents that would do that to their 20-year-olds who were studying abroad, like, just show up, and they don't know anything, like, about the whole, like, deception bit. Like, they just show up to show up. And then, like, I don't know, I was like, okay, I guess. Like, they don't even tell her. They just show up and then are like, okay, we're gonna take all your friends out to dinner and we're not taking no for an answer. And I'm just like, who does that? Who is that? Who does that? And so then Sarah apparently can't take a hint and she like kind of spills everything because her parents are like, oh, Sarah, like you work at the medical clinic with our daughter, don't you? And she's like, what? And like they keep trying to like hint at her like, hey, don't do this. And then she doesn't get the hint and it's like a mess and it blows up and her parents are crazy mad at her and like they practically disown Shane and it's just like it's a whole blow up. I mean, to be fair, she didn't lie to them. Like, I mean, I can't really blame them for being upset for lying to them about like what she was doing. But they like cut her off in anger and then so all of this happens and then she quits her internship with this travel writing firm and she just kind of muddles through the whole rest of the semester in this like very, very like melancholy blur. And I'm like, why would you quit your internship? I mean, go ahead and finish it. I mean, it's already paid for. Like, I mean, yes, you're gonna have to do all this makeup work for your med school or whatever, but at least finish the internship because that's just like that's putting your internship employers in a bad spot. Like, you know, I mean, because they're depending on you. And yeah, I was just like, that, okay, whatever. Stuff's not good with Leo, but again, we went over, he's not really, like, that comes into play in part 2. Her parents are still crazy mad, obviously. And then we skip ahead to part 2. And so Shane went back, studied for med school, whatever, finished with her bachelor's, and she's, did she finish? Yeah, she finished med school. And then she's applying for residencies in gastroenterology. She has a serious boyfriend that is also going into gastroenterology. No, that is not how much powder I wanted. Don't do that. Oh my goodness. I forgot that did not have a sifter on it. Holy crap. Anyway, so this boyfriend is also going into gastroenterology. She's not really passionate about it. She just kind of chose it. And I don't know if residency interviews are a ton different than like PhD interviews for clinical psych, but the guy was asking her like obscure personality questions and then exactly what his most recent publication was. And then he cuts the interview off. And I'm like, okay, I don't know if this is like typical of what most residency interviews look like, but the guy was definitely a jerk and she dodged a bullet because that's not how most interview, I mean, if it is anything like PhD clinical psych interviews, and again, I know there will probably be some differences. Okay, sorry, my camera overheated, so I just threw on lashes and I tried using this new, it's like eyelash glue and liquid eyeliner, and I am not sure it actually makes applying lashes any easier, and I didn't cut them, and I'm thinking that wasn't the lashes, and I'm thinking that was a mistake because they're kind of uncomfortable on my inner eye, but they're also like $3 lashes, so it's my own dang fault. Oh no, is that, yeah, it's sticking up again, dang it. Stay, you only have to stay put for like 10 more minutes, okay. Alrighty, so anyway, I'm obviously not sure how residency interviews though go, but that guy seemed mean enough that it seemed like she dodged a bullet. So I'm gonna leave it at that. And there is a doctor in the acknowledgements that apparently helped Christine with the, like all of the medical stuff, so I'm not sure if that is an indication that that is actually what residency interviews are like, and so if my own grad school interviews are anything to go by, that guy was a jerk and she dodged a bullet. Okay, so she has a boyfriend and he asks her to marry him and she's just not sure. She knows that Pilot is working in the city, it's in NYC, so she just randomly shows up. Because I mean, basically she's been feeling unsure and unsatisfied about her life since London and that catastrophe, so she feels like talking to Pilot will give her like some clarity and closure. So they end up going to this cafe called Rewrite to talk, and I was like, I think I know where this is going, and the red-headed barista plain lady who kept showing up is there, and she was like, make a wish, like you might have a chance to begin again, and I was like, we're gonna time travel. And I was right, they get stuck in an elevator in the time travel, and then the lady's like, there's a reset button in Rome, and so basically they're back in 2011 going through the whole study abroad experience again, and yeah, that's basically what happens. So then it is, one thing I was glad about with that was that it wasn't just Shane who remembered, it was also Pilot, and so they're both having to go through this together, being 20 rather than like 26 or 27, and having to go through all of that together, which I really liked. And then it gets into all the cute fluffy romantic stuff, and there's still some miscommunications and stuff they have to work through, but basically from that point on it is a little more of your standard fluffy YA coming of age romance. Yeah, and it is cute. The fluffy romance part is cute. That part worked well. She sends a preemptive breakup letter to the boyfriend she hasn't met yet. That is in the original timeline, which actually made me laugh. Stuff gets cute. The girlfriend comes back because there was miscommunication on Pilot's part. He like broke up with her, but then it didn't quite happen the way he thought it did, and I was like, really? Miscommunication? Do we have to do this now? But whatever. And then it ends with this trip to Edinburgh, and there's this grand romantic move, and then we get into the epilogue, and the epilogue was actually a little jarring because it suddenly changes from this first person POV we've been in the whole time to this random girl who's interviewing Shane years later, and is talking to her about her success as a writer, because of course it's not perfect. Like the one thing I did like, it did take some time for her to get where she wanted to go. It wasn't just completely perfect and fluffy from part 2 on, but she did eventually get where she wanted to go, and this epilogue was kind of to show that. And then there's a proposal. So switching to this random girl's blog was just very jarring. I wish that wasn't in there. And then it goes back to Shane for the remainder of the epilogue, and I was like, that was just weird. I didn't like that. The proposal was cute. So that was pretty much all of that. So this is the final look. I am going to go ahead and do my final summary. For the look, it was just kind of simple, and they mentioned that one of the characters wore red lipstick, and it's just kind of a normal makeup look, because that was what I have, and I need to work quickly because I am losing sunlight and I am moving soon, so all of my lamps are packed. So let's go fast. Final summary. I liked part 2 a lot better, and it felt a lot more genuine. I just clicked with it better. I wish part 1 was streamlined, and part 1 especially still very much reminds me of how I wrote when I was 15, and again, as I mentioned earlier, I just couldn't totally get over it. It was just weird, which isn't necessarily Christine's fault. It's just, for me personally, it was weird. Yeah, the writing style, especially in part 1, felt very stream of consciousness, Wattpad-esque, but once I sort of got into it, it was more okay. There were still a few moments that pulled me out even beyond the suspension of disbelief, but it wasn't bad. It was just more wish fulfillment stuff. But I like how part 2 was much better at that, much more realistic and genuine than part 1. There were a few moments that actually did make me chuckle, and I liked leaning into the wanderlust and nostalgia, and it made me really want to go back to the UK. Dang it, I want to be in London again. Also, then I could say hi to my friends now, but I'd be like, hi to them! Okay, sorry, that was... It did make me really want to travel again though, so, which in 2020 is the best thing to want to do, right? Right, the dichotomy between creative pursuits and sciences really isn't as drastic and stark as the book implies. Speaking from personal experience, you can very much pursue both. They are not mutually exclusive, and it seems to portray that like you can either have this one thing or the other thing. You can't pursue both, which I do understand well, it's my parents' want for me, not mine, but she does actually genuinely like aspects of the medical side of things. She's just not like, it's not her true ultimate passion. You know, it didn't completely necessarily have to be all one or the other. Like, I think, like, even though the ending of her completely switching and doing creative writing and all that stuff, like, even though that was good, I think it would have been equally or more satisfying to have her still pursue the medical school stuff, but then also find a way to make her creative writing and her passion still come through. And speaking as someone who loves both like science-based medical stuff and creative stuff like writing and theater and arts, and trying to find ways to balance, just speaking from experience, those two pursuits, the creative and the scientific, don't have to be as mutually exclusive as the book necessarily portrays them to be. Like, at least that's how the character views it, so in that sense it's real, but so completely just choosing one or the other didn't have to be the solution. And I think it would have been interesting if it hadn't been, but beside the point. Overall, it's okay. It's definitely not a favorite. It reads a lot younger than I think it was intended. Again, especially in part 1, which leads me again to believe that it was intentionally less mature in that section, but it just didn't quite hit the mark for me. A 20-year-old that has never had a kiss or whatever doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be excitable and flighty as a 15-year-old coming of age book. I understand the want to kind of write it a little bit younger and show that progression, but it felt like it was still a little too young, because you're still different as a 20-year-old in a coming of age book than you would be at 15 in a coming of age book, or 16 or whatever. Like, you're still developed, you still have this life experience. Like, even if it's not quite the same as someone who's had all these experiences younger or whatever, you still have, like, she's still this pre-med student who's very bright. She has all of this other stuff. Like, she doesn't necessarily have to be portrayed as young as I think she was in part 1. If it were a lot shorter, I would probably recommend it as like a fluffy, fast YA read, but it feels like it's too long for that. So I don't know. I don't know quite how to categorize or place it. I was still 15. I probably would have really loved it. It would have been a lot more my style, but I'm not. So, and since this is supposed to be a coming of age more for current me than 15-year-old me, that makes me unsure how well it actually succeeds at its goal. And, you know, maybe someone else who is my age might view this differently. I might really connect to it and think, yes, this is exactly what I needed. This really hits the mark for me. But I just think for me personally, it wasn't quite there. It wasn't quite as meaty or deep as I think it was intended to be. There was just a few marks that were missed. You know, again, this was Christine's debut novel, so there's always room for improvement. I think, you know, this isn't me saying that it's a terrible book. It was okay. It wasn't anything amazing. It wasn't anything necessarily groundbreaking, but it wasn't the worst book I've ever read. It wasn't the worst book I've read this year. It just was. So with that, that's pretty much all I have for today. The sun is setting. The day is good. If you've read the book, I would be curious to know what you think of it. It is interesting coming from like a booktuber. And again, I hadn't heard of her before all of this, and so I thought it was interesting, especially going in not knowing that it was written by a booktuber. I think that gave me a little bit more objectivity to it. I think it's interesting. And you know, a lot of YouTuber books end up being like memoirs or nonfiction, so I like having a fiction book coming from a booktuber or just a YouTuber in general. That makes sense. So yeah, if you are into coming of age YA stories, you might actually really enjoy this. If you have read the book, please tell me what you thought. I'm curious. If Christine ever happens to see this for some reason, I mean, still congratulations for actually publishing a book. It takes so much thought and effort, and I know a lot went into this, and it was definitely a passion project because you wanted the book to be something like that you didn't have when you were younger. So I definitely appreciate the passion and hard work that went into the book, and not every book is going to connect with everyone, and that's okay. With that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for joining me. Please make sure that you like, comment, subscribe, all those YouTuber-y things. But I hope you have an absolutely beautiful day. Stay magic, keep reading, and I love you all so, so much. Goodbye!